hospital porque se hallaron en el apartamento minúsculos restos de sangre. Cuando vosotros os enteráis de eso, de que la policía ha descubierto sangre en el apartamento, ¿cómo reaccionáis?
Do you know what? This is all investigation. I mean, speak to the police. You know, all your questions are about investigation. And we can't comment on it.
You know, they must have known, you know, that Gerry had just been into the apartment, and then, you're right, there was only a small window of opportunity, but, you know.
We tried to leave it as undisturbed as possible, and they slept very soundly until we moved them out of the courts into the other apartment. Which does make you wonder about whether there was any substances used to keep them asleep.
Meu nome é Gonçalo Amaral. Fui investigador da Polícia Judiciária durante 27 anos. Coordenei a investigação do desaparecimento de Madeleine McCann no dia 3 de maio de 2007. Nos próximos 50 minutos, vou provar que a criança não foi raptada e que morreu no apartamento de férias na Praia da Luz. Descubra toda a verdade sobre o que se passou naquele dia. Uma morte que muita gente...
While the McCanns and their lawyers often left most Portuguese media outlets and journalists untouched, there was one man they refused to ignore: Gonçalo Amaral. In October 2007, after being abruptly removed from the investigation, the former lead detective began work on a book about the case. Drawing from his 6 months at the helm, Amaral laid out his perspective on the investigation and a theory of what had happened to Madeleine. 2 days after the Portuguese police formally shelved their inquiry in July 2008, Amaral released The Truth of the Lie. The 22-chapter book immediately sparked one of the most bitter and high-profile legal battles connected to the case. The McCanns insisted that the book would severely damage the search for their daughter. Their argument was simple. If the public believed Madeleine was dead, who would continue looking for her? They launched a determined legal campaign to silence Amaral's account. At first, they succeeded. An injunction banned the book, and Amaral was ordered to pay the McCanns €500,000 in damages. Kate McCann hailed the court's decision, calling the publication an injustice against her daughter. She told reporters the ruling proved there was no evidence Madeleine had come to harm, and questioned the motives of Amaral and others pushing the idea that she was dead.
Pleased and relieved with the judge's decision yesterday. By upholding the injunction against Gonçalo Amaral's book and DVD, the judge has agreed that there has been significant, ongoing damage to the search for Madeleine and to the rights of our family. We are grateful to the judge for accepting that this injustice, to Madeleine in particular, must not continue. The court has demonstrated once again that there is no evidence that Madeleine has succumbed to any harm. It has also clearly shown that no police force is actively looking for Madeleine, even when presented with new information and leads. The motives of Mr. Amaral and others who have tried to convince the world that Madeleine is dead, and who've also tried to implicate us in her disappearance, need to be seriously questioned and looked at.
The tide, however, would turn. In 2016, the injunction was overturned, with Portugal's courts ruling that Amaral's right to freedom of expression had been violated. The McCanns fought the decision, but in early 2017, the country's Supreme Court rejected their appeal. The judges concluded that the book was neither libellous nor abusive, and that Amaral had acted within his rights as a citizen and as a writer. The book had quickly become a bestseller, selling around 180,000 copies in Portugal alone, before spreading to other European countries. From the beginning, the stance was clear. Banning a book was never an option. The argument was simple. An accidental death in the apartment was one of the scenarios considered during the official investigation, and no one could forbid people from making logical assumptions. Portugal's Supreme Court echoed this reasoning, ruling that Amaril's book did not harm the McCann's privacy or reputation, since everything it contained was already part of public police reports long before it was published. There was a machine against him, and that machine did anything it could to cause him harm. In this final episode, we're going to be looking into Amaril's theory. But before that, I want to underline the potential importance of the DNA and the forensic evidence pulled from the McCann's rental car, the silver Renault Scenic. Before we analyze the suspicions in the case, please tell me where you saw this video from. I will read it all and spread it to the world. In this series, we're not just retelling the headlines. We're digging deeper. We're exploring the evidence, the inconsistencies, and the overlooked details that might make you question everything you think you know about the disappearance of Madeleine McCann. I'd like to emphasize the potential significance of the DNA and forensic evidence connected to the McCann's rental vehicle, the silver Renault Scenic. In November 2007, the BBC program Panorama focused on that car. Reporter Richard Bilton spoke with John Corner, a close friend of the McCanns, who had been filming material for a family-approved documentary at the time. In the Panorama segment, Bilton discussed how it had been suggested that Madeleine's body was transported in the back of this vehicle, which the McCanns had hired 25 days after her disappearance. Some reports claimed the couple drove the Scenic to Huelva, Spain, on August 3rd, where the body was allegedly disposed of. The McCanns, however, pointed to Corner's footage, which documented what they insisted was their only trip to Huelva. For them, the video itself was proof showing that the journey was part of an awareness campaign.
That the body was shifted in the back of this vehicle, a Renault Scenic the McCanns hired 25 days after Madeleine disappeared. The story goes that they drove the car to Huelva in Spain on the 3rd of August, where they disposed of the body. According to the McCanns, these pictures show the only trip they made to Huelva.
Bizarre. Truly bizarre. I mean, we used it as a base for the crew. In the back of that vehicle was a lot of posters of Madeleine and me and my cameraman. It's quite sickening, really, the speculation around what was a genuine trip out to Spain to try and raise public awareness about Madeleine.
Corner himself described the speculation as deeply offensive, stressing that this was simply a family fighting desperately to keep their missing daughter in the public eye. It was later noted that police sources had expressed interest in the Scenic, particularly regarding the unusually high mileage. The car was rented on May 27, 2007, with 3,100 kilometers already on the odometer. By the time it was returned on September 23rd, the reading had climbed to 14,400 kilometers. Over 4 months, the Scenic had covered more than 11,000 kilometers despite long stretches when Kate and Gerry were away on trips across Europe. The investigation into the vehicle intensified when cadaver dog Eddie and blood dog Keela alerted to scents inside and around the car, including the boot. Their handler, Martin Grime, explained that the dogs were trained to detect odor, not to determine guilt or cause of death. Their alerts simply marked areas that warranted closer examination. Forensic samples were collected, but the testing proved inconclusive. Grime explained that dismissing the dog's work because DNA results weren't definitive was a misunderstanding. The dogs had indicated locations worth investigating, and in both apartment 5A and the Scenic, DNA was indeed recovered. The failure, he argued, lay not in the dogs, but in the forensic techniques used by the lab at the time. This leads to one of the most pressing questions. If Madeleine's body had truly been inside the Scenic, how could such a transfer have occurred under the constant glare of the press and police? It was later noted that it wasn't only Kate and Gerry using the vehicle. Others also had access to it during that period. A similar point was raised about the McCanns' extensive travels from Morocco to Rome, Berlin, Amsterdam, and even the Vatican. While the couple moved across Europe, the press frequently followed them abroad, leaving the Renault Scenic unobserved back in Portugal. Amaral also dismissed the idea that the couple was under non-stop surveillance. He pointed out that there were stretches of time, especially overnight in Praia da Luz, when no journalists were present, and when the McCanns left town, reporters went with them, meaning the villa and car were not under constant watch. Later, in a controversial documentary based on The Truth of the Lie, a woman claimed to have witnessed something unusual involving the McCanns' rental car. She lived close to the Praia da Luz villa that the couple moved into in early July 2007 after leaving apartment 5A at the Ocean Club Resort. In the program, her face was not shown, but she alleged that over a number of days she repeatedly noticed the boot of the Renault Scenic left open day and night. From what is known, this woman was a lawyer who had contacted the Polizia Giudiziaria, and because of her profession, she was considered a credible witness. What makes the account more striking is that nobody seems to have denied that there was an issue with a strong smell in the car. It was explained away at the time as the result of transporting trash bags. But if we think about it, why would trash need to be carried in the car unless the bins were far away? And if the bags really had holes, as suggested, then the smell would only have been stronger. To police investigators, the whole situation hinted at something more sinister, an attempt to mask the scent of a cadaver. What stood out to me after watching the documentary and hearing this woman's allegations about the open car boot was that her account didn't appear in the official police files. Still, it seems clear that she had indeed spoken with investigators, whether formally or informally. And the matter of the Renault Scenic wasn't just hearsay. It was reinforced later when McCann family members themselves mentioned the issue of transporting trash. In fact, 2 relatives gave police statements about a strange smell in the hire car. One was Alexander Cameron, who was then married to Gerry's sister, Patricia. The other was Michael Wright, married to Kate's cousin. Both had traveled to Praia da Luz to support the McCanns and were even added as drivers on the Renault Scenic rental agreement. Almost a year later, in April 2008, Portuguese police asked their British counterparts to take formal statements from both men. They were firm in saying Kate and Gerry could never have been involved in Madeleine's disappearance, that it was impossible. But even so, both admitted there had been an unusual odor lingering in the car. Their descriptions were consistent, strange and unpleasant. Michael Wright suggested the smell may have come from rubbish bags containing Sean and Amelie's nappies, which had been left in the boot. Alexander Cameron believed it might have been the result of blood leaking from beef, fish and shrimp he had bought from a store and placed in the car. He even recalled the stench being so strong that he removed the boot carpet, washed it, and then put it back. On May 3rd, 2007, Madeleine was there. Sometime after nightfall, but before midnight, she was suddenly gone. 14 months later, the case was shelved by Portuguese police. Despite the exhaustive investigation, there was evidence, but nothing conclusive enough to prove how or what had happened to Madeleine. Having laid out the forensic leads around the Renault Scenic, I'll set out Amaral's theory presented here as a working hypothesis and then examine each step in turn. The theory begins with a simple but unsettling claim that the version of events most of us grew accustomed to the story of abduction may not be the true one. Instead, it argues that Madeleine died inside apartment 5A, and that what followed was an attempt to disguise that fact.
Nos próximos 50 minutos, vou provar que a criança não foi raptada e que morreu no apartamento de férias na Praia da Luz.
From the outset, investigators faced enormous pressure. Media exposure, political involvement, and diplomatic sensitivities all weighed heavily on the case. Unlike most investigations, this one could not be handled as an ordinary disappearance. Every move was scrutinized, and at times it seemed there was a deliberate effort to stifle or silence parts of the inquiry. Witnesses were hesitant, some even afraid, and key procedures, such as a full reenactment of the night's events, were never carried out. Amaral, a former PJ inspector who coordinated the investigation into Madeleine McCann's disappearance, presents an alternative version of events, one that is strongly rejected by the McCanns, who maintain this was an abduction. More than assigning blame, he argues the purpose of his book and documentary was to shed light on the inconsistencies of the investigation and help the public understand why the case remains unresolved. He states that Madeleine was not abducted, but instead died in the holiday apartment in Praia da Luz, a death that, in his view, many people wanted to cover up. On May 3, 2007, Kate and Gerry McCann made a desperate televised appeal, asking for their daughter's safe return.
Words cannot describe the anguish and despair that we are feeling as the parents of our beautiful daughter Madeleine. We request that anyone who may have any information related to Madeleine's disappearance, no matter how trivial, contact the Portuguese police and help us get her back safely. Please, if you have Madeleine, let her come home to her mummy, daddy, brother and sister.
That night, the version of events accepted by most was that a child, asleep with her siblings, had been abducted. But Amaral asks, is that truly what happened, or was another crime concealed behind this narrative? He stresses that from the outset there was pressure to silence aspects of the case. English police officers were forbidden from speaking publicly. Some witnesses felt afraid to testify, and others were actively prevented from speaking out. Amaral points to the importance of a reconstitution, a reenactment of events that could have clarified contradictions in testimonies. But that reconstitution never happened. According to him, certain parties resisted it, arguing it would imply suspicion of the McCanns and their friends while also raising the risk of flight. From the very beginning, Amaral says, the investigation was made unusually difficult. There was heavy media exposure, political involvement, and diplomatic pressure, all of which prevented the case from being treated like any other disappearance.
A reconstituição não foi feita porque houve quem defendesse que isso seria considerar a família suspeita, bem como o risco de fuga. Desde o início que a Polícia Judiciária foi pressionada para não investigar este caso.
The last confirmed public sighting of Madeleine McCann was at 5:30 p.m. on May 3rd, when Kate McCann picked her up from the resort's creche. At that same time, Gerry McCann was playing tennis a few hundred meters away, a detail confirmed by court records and his police statement. Meanwhile, the McCann's friends were having tea at the Paraíso restaurant. CCTV footage shows the men leaving at 6:13 p.m., followed 15 minutes later by the women. One of them, David Payne, went to meet Gerry at the tennis court. According to Payne's police statement, he then headed to the McCann's apartment around 6:30 p.m. to check on Kate. In later questioning, however, the accounts diverged. Gerry claimed Payne stayed in the apartment for 30 minutes, while Kate insisted it was only 30 seconds. At that time, she said she was bathing the twins and Madeleine. Shortly after 8:40 p.m., the so-called Tapas 9 gathered for dinner at the Tapas bar, about 50 meters from their apartments. Inside apartment 5A, Madeleine and the twins, Sean and Amelie, were left asleep. At around 10 o'clock p.m., Kate McCann raised the alarm. Madeleine was not in her bed. By 10:40 p.m., the GNR police in Lagos received a call reporting the disappearance of a little girl from the Ocean Club. According to the resort manager, Gerry McCann threw himself at an officer's feet in desperation. Officers later reported that the same scene was repeated inside the couple's bedroom.
The gerente do Ocean Club Quando a patrulha da GNR chegou ao local, o pai da criança atirou-se aos pés dos militares, como rezam os árabes, completamente descontrolado com o desaparecimento da filha. A cena repetiu-se, segundo os militares da GNR, no quarto do casal.
Borders were alerted, vehicles were checked, and what became the largest search operation ever carried out in Portugal was launched. Hundreds of GNR officers, firefighters, volunteers, and police searched more than 200 kilometers, yet no trace of Madeleine was found. Despite the failure, Amaral recalls, hope remained alive. Under Portuguese law, abduction doesn't only imply ransom, it can also include sexual motives. For that reason, the authorities continued to assume Madeleine might still be alive. The McCanns and their friends were soon questioned. Gerry McCann, 39, Kate Healy, 39, David Payne, 41, Fiona Payne, 35, and her mother, Diane Webster, 63, Matthew Oldfield, 38, Rachel Oldfield, 37, Russell O'Brien, 37, and Jane Tanner, 36. All gave initial statements. Over that first week, hundreds of witnesses were interviewed, from family members and resort employees to anyone who had contact with the child. From these statements, Amaral says, investigators began to piece together the events of the night. In fact, family and friends had already drafted their own collective version, written on the back of one of Madeleine's coloring books, and this draft was used to align their depositions. According to that version, at 8:45 p.m., the McCanns arrived at the tapas bar, followed shortly by their friends. Because the children were left alone, the group took turns checking the apartments. Around 9:05 p.m., Matthew Oldfield reported that everything seemed quiet. Between 9:05 p.m. and 9:10 p.m., Gerry McCann went to his apartment, entered through the front door, and checked on the children. He later claimed he had a strange sense that someone else had been in the room, but at the time, everything appeared normal. When leaving, Gerry encountered an English TV producer outside, walking his child to sleep. They spoke beneath the apartment's living room window around 9:10 p.m. The timeline continues that evening, with Jane Tanner leaving the tapas bar to check on her children. On her way past the McCann's apartment, she crossed Gerry McCann and Jeremy Wilkins, who were talking outside. Jane would later tell authorities that she saw a stranger carrying a child in his arms along Rua Doutor Agostinho da Silva around 9:30 p.m. Meanwhile, Russell O'Brien and Matthew Oldfield also checked the apartments. Matthew said he looked through the door of the McCann children's bedroom, but could only see the twins. Russell stayed behind for a while to care for his sick daughter, then returned to the tapas bar at around 9:50 p.m. At roughly the same time, on the other side of town, another potential sighting took place. The Smith family, 4 adults and 5 children, had just finished dinner at the Dolphin restaurant, where their receipt was time-stamped at 9:27 p.m. After briefly stopping for a drink at Kelly's bar, they began walking back toward their holiday apartment at the Estrela da Luz resort at about 9:50 p.m. As they crossed 25 de Abril Street near Escola Primaria Street, they saw a man carrying a child in his arms. Back at the Ocean Club, just after 10:00 p.m., Kate McCann went to check on her children. Taking the shorter route, she entered through the sliding patio door and discovered Madeleine was gone. She claimed the bedroom window and shutters were open. At that moment, she left the twins sleeping in a room with an open window and ran to raise the alarm. But here, Amaral points out, her behavior becomes difficult to understand. Instead of calling out immediately toward the tapas bar, which was only about 50 meters away, Kate reportedly took a longer path, descending the stairs and doubling the distance before reaching the restaurant. When she arrived, she shouted, "We've let her down," a phrase commonly used in medicine to mean, "she's gone." Everyone rushed back to apartment 5A, again entering through the main front door rather than the sliding window. According to Amaral, this is where contradictions begin to surface. The first contradiction concerns distance. Every member of the group except Kate stated they always used the front doors when checking the children, a route that was over 100 meters longer. Only the McCanns admitted they had left the sliding patio door unlocked, claiming they could see it from the restaurant. Amaral argues it seems incomprehensible that parents in a hurry would take a longer route, especially when a shorter one was available. In fact, even Gerry McCann said that when he checked the children earlier, he was in a hurry to use the toilet. Yet, he still took the longer way around. Looking at the map, Amaral marked the routes. The yellow line shows the shorter path through the sliding window, while the red line shows the longer path all of the parents insisted they took, almost twice the distance. According to Amaral, the group may have been attempting to protect themselves against accusations of neglect. Leaving young children alone in an unlocked apartment could be considered child endangerment, a crime severely punished under UK law. By insisting they always used the front doors, Amaral suggests they were trying to demonstrate they had acted responsibly. The second contradiction centers on Jane Tanner's account. She claimed to have seen the abductor walking away with a child, yet Gerry McCann and Jeremy Wilkins, standing nearby, said they noticed nothing. How could Jane have seen the man? While neither Gerry McCann nor Jeremy Wilkins saw her or the supposed abductor, the only possible explanation, Amaral suggests, comes from Russell O'Brien's testimony. He claimed Jane had actually seen the man when returning from her apartment, not while heading toward it. This would mean she could have crossed paths with Wilkins and Gerry without them seeing her, but only if she had come from the back of the apartment using the sliding door. Even so, Amaral concludes that the detailed description Jane later gave of the alleged abductor, right down to his clothing, was implausible, given the distance, lighting, and fleeting nature of the sighting. Jane Tanner asserts that she clearly saw 5 specific details at that distance and with so little light. First, she saw a dark-haired man, aged between 35 and 40, slender, with hair falling down his neck. Second, the man wore linen trousers in a shade between beige and golden. Third, he wore a thin duffel jacket. Fourth, he had on black classical shoes. And fifth, the man walked quickly, carrying a child outstretched in his arms, a posture that seemed more like a statue than someone actually carrying a child. Jane's statements became the basis for the abduction theory, but for Amaral, and later even the English police, they had doubtful value. How could she see so much detail at such a distance and under such poor lighting? And how was it possible that Gerry and Jeremy, who were right there, did not see Jane or the supposed abductor at all? This sighting also raises another problem. Jane said she saw the man crossing Agostinho da Silva Street at 9:20 p.m. Less than 30 minutes later, the Smith family also saw a man carrying a child, this time on Escola Primaria Street on the other side of the village and walking in the opposite direction of the man Jane described. 2 separate sightings of men carrying children, both within half an hour, yet they don't confirm each other in either time or direction. The Smiths describe the man differently too, carrying the child against his chest, not stretched out in his arms. Still, based on the man's physical description, Amaral notes that they could have been speaking of the same person, and in a while he explains who that might have been and who, in his eyes, was lying. The third contradiction emerges with the window. If, at 9:20 p.m., Jane saw the abductor with the child, and Kate later noticed that the children's bedroom window had been opened, why did Russell and Matt, who checked the apartments after 9:20 p.m., not see the open window? Amaral says, this is impossible. If the child had been abducted at the time Jane claimed, then the window should have been open from that very moment. Yet Matthew, who entered the apartment, never mentioned seeing it. The conclusion drawn was that the window had only been opened after the supposed abduction. After this came the leads, and the case of Robert Murat. Over 350 leads were followed, with even reports claiming Madeleine had been seen in Morocco. But eventually suspicion fell on Murat, a local man who spoke both Portuguese and English, and had volunteered to help with the search. He was made an arguido, a person of interest, but not yet a suspect. Though no evidence justified his detention, his behavior seemed unusual to some observers. Amaral points out that journalists suspected Murat early on, but instead of following media speculation, investigators focused on testimony, particularly Jane Tanner's, because without her account, the abduction theory itself collapsed. Her testimony placed a man carrying a child walking in the direction of Murat's house. What happened next, according to Amaral, further exposed contradictions. Jane Tanner was placed in a surveillance vehicle and asked to observe people passing by. Among them was Murat, whom she identified based only on the way he walked, claiming he was the man she had seen carrying the child. As time went on, her memory appeared to improve. First, she contributed to a vague EFIT sketch. Later, she identified Murat positively, and months after that, she helped create another EFIT. This time, she miraculously recalled every detail of a face that looked nothing like Murat's. Another piece, used to incriminate Murat, was a psychological profile produced by English experts. It suggested that his voluntary, helpful attitude in the days after the disappearance could in fact be the mask of a criminal. Amaral dismisses this, saying such theories were based on generalities and banalities, statistical guesses that could apply to anyone, but were used here to fit suspicion. And while the investigation circled around contradictions and suspects, the media frenzy grew into a global phenomenon. Images of Madeleine filled the world's screens. Appeals for prayers, donations, and information spread everywhere. The case was no longer just a Portuguese investigation. It had become an international spectacle. The abduction theory, Amaral explains, eventually led into a blind alley. Even the McCann family themselves began to consider the possibility that Madeleine was no longer alive. The first signs of death, he says, didn't come from investigators but from the family. They hired a former South African military officer who claimed to use a miraculous machine to locate bodies. He pointed to a vast area where Madeleine's remains were supposedly buried, but after a thorough search, nothing was found. With the investigation at a stalemate, a major turnaround came when Portuguese authorities brought in 2 highly trained dogs, animals already credited with solving over 200 difficult cases in both the UK and the US. Eddie, a cadaver dog, was trained to detect the odor of human remains. Keela, a blood dog, specialized in finding traces of human blood in amounts so tiny they often went unnoticed by forensic investigators. The dogs first inspected the homes connected to the case, the apartments of the McCanns and their friends, and the house of Robert Murat. The results were striking. The dogs only reacted inside the apartment where the McCann family had stayed. Eddie, the cadaver dog, alerted in 2 places. First, he marked the wardrobe in the McCann's bedroom, pressing his nose into the corner and signaling the unmistakable scent of death, either on the shelf or on the floor. Then he alerted again behind the sofa in the apartment's living room. Keela was then brought in. She confirmed the presence of human blood behind that same sofa. According to Amaral, the implication was clear. Either a body had been kept in that spot for some time, or it had at least passed through the apartment. The dogs' investigation continued outside the apartment. They were led to several vehicles, but once again, they only reacted to one. the Renault Scenic that the McCanns had rented 23 days after Madeleine's disappearance. Eddie alerted both to the car key and to the boot, signaling that they had been in contact with a dead body. Keeler confirmed this by detecting organic traces for forensic analysis inside the boot. Even more telling were other alerts. The dogs signaled Kate McCann's clothing and Madeleine's own soft toy. For Amaral, these findings raised disturbing questions. How was it possible that a toy carried constantly by the child could show the odor of death, while the bed where she supposedly slept showed no signs at all, and no evidence that she had even been there that night? The dogs had never failed in more than 200 previous cases. Their alerts marked 2 areas inside the apartment: the McCann's rental car, Kate's clothing, and Madeleine's toy. According to Amaral, their work could hardly have been more revealing. According to Amaral, this was the true turning point in the investigation. The abduction theory began to lose strength, while the hypothesis of Madeleine's death gained consistency. From this point on, the parents, their friends, and even their relatives were no longer just witnesses. They became suspects. The forensic samples collected in Portugal were sent to the Forensic Science Service, FSS, in Birmingham, one of the most respected laboratories in the UK. Almost immediately, speculation began. The Times newspaper published that some preliminary results did not match Madeleine's DNA. The lab denied it. Other journalists, however, insisted they had seen early reports suggesting otherwise. One of those journalists explained that preliminary findings had pointed to blood traces inside the apartment, and that later documentation, signed by more than 10 FSS scientists, showed a striking result: a correspondence of 17 out of 19 markers with Madeleine McCann's DNA. In their eyes, there was more than enough data to conclude it was hers. To understand the process, Amaral points to the forensic method used, low copy number, LCN analysis. Because the samples collected from the apartment and the McCann's rental car were so small, scientists had to artificially amplify the DNA. The method can be useful, but it also risks amplifying background noise, making results more difficult to interpret. The FSS's final report was cautious. It concluded the samples could belong to Madeleine, but certainty was impossible. The most significant sample came from the boot of the Renault Scenic, rented by the McCanns 23 days after their daughter disappeared. Preliminary reports showed a match of 15 out of 16 markers. Yet, analysis also revealed that the material was not from a single source, but from at least 3 different people. Given these complex and often contradictory findings, how do you reconcile the seemingly conflicting information? Do you find that the lack of definitive evidence strengthens the case for one theory over another, or does it simply deepen the mystery for you?